Hello, my name is Sydney Hartman, and today I'll be presenting on my project, which is called Death by a Thousand Paper Cuts, an exploration of 21st century US women's political organizations. And I worked on this project alongside Professor Lita Maxwell in the political science department at BU. So first, to give a little bit of background information on the state of women in politics today. First, as of 2021, women occupy only 26.7% of the total seats in Congress, about 24% of the 100 seats in the Senate, 27.4% of the total seats in the House of Representatives, and only 27% of the mayoral positions in the 100 largest US cities. So a study done by Lawless and Fox in 2010 found that there are three factors that increase female political participation. The first is resources, so having the civic skills, time, and money to participate. Providing motivation, which is providing people with interest in being involved and self-confidence that they can be involved. And then finally, recruitment, which is just encouragement. So these factors are the most common strategies utilized by women's political organizations to increase female political participation. So for my project, I decided I wanted to research women's political organizations and specifically ask three questions. First, what are the different organizational structures and strategies utilized by women's political organizations? How does each organization define success? And why has there been such a proliferation in women's political organizations in recent years, given that all WPOs have the same overall mission and goals, which is to increase the representation of women in politics? So for my project, I decided to interview 7 different representatives from 7 women's political organizations. Although there's no official number, certain studies that I found have predicted that there are around 700 women's political organizations in the United States today. But I picked these 7 because they represent both national, local, partisan, and nonpartisan women's political organizations. So for my project, I decided to interview these women and compile an anthology of my interviews with them called Death by a Thousand Paper Cuts. So this QR code here is a QR code that will direct you to the entire anthology with all the transcripts of the interviews with the women I interviewed, if you would like to read it in its entirety. But for this presentation, I will just discuss some of the main takeaways I took from these interviews. So the first takeaway is that barriers to women, there are barriers that keep women from entering political office. And Nina Liang from Emerge, Massachusetts discusses the idea that these barriers are referred to as something called death by a thousand paper cuts. So it's death by a thousand paper cuts, and it cuts us down and it makes us feel like we're not qualified for this job or qualified for this position or qualified to run for office or qualified to lead. It's death by a thousand paper cuts from generations in history. So to get into a little discussion about what some of these paper cuts are or some of these barriers that keep women from entering politics, the first that the woman I interviewed mentioned was self-doubt or imposter syndrome, which is defined as imposters suffer from chronic self-doubt and a sense of intellectual fraudulence that override any feelings of success or external proof of their competence. And this idea of imposter syndrome can be found by a study from American University that found that among Democratic men and women, 24% of women feel like they'd be qualified to run for office that day, while 35% of men feel like they'd be qualified to run for office. And this difference is even more stark among the GOP, where 20% of GOP women feel like they'd be qualified to run for office, as opposed to 41% of GOP men. The next barrier is something I call the role model effect, which is the idea that there's not a lot of women in politics today, which creates a lack of a female leadership pipeline for other women to have women to look up to in politics. There's also this idea of the old boys network that many of the representatives I talked to discussed, which is this idea that there's a kind of secret club or exclusive club among the upper echelons of politics, where a lot of usually straight old white men will kind of have the power and be able to exclude women from the resources that they provide to themselves. So Cindy McCain, who's a BU law professor, said that the only way to combat the old boys network is to form women-centered networks to help women give and get peer mentorship, empower women in the workplace, and, as it were, replicate the old boys club. So Ryan Olson from Emerge America explains why this old boys club is important and detrimental to women entering politics. She says, a lot of people say things like, oh, imagine a politician, and they imagine an old straight white man, which means that when party leaders or activists or unions are trying to recruit for a seat, their immediate brain heuristic goes to, okay, who most fits into this elected official shape map in my head? And it tends to be the easiest to fit in someone who looks like that before. The next barrier is political ambition. A study called Getting Past the Gender Gap in Political Ambition found that as of college age, there's already about a 20% gender gap in political ambition. And there are 2 hypotheses as to why this is. The first is that there are gender differences in key traits that increase an individual's willingness to run for office. So for example, men are more aggressive, men are more natural leaders, things like that. The second hypothesis is that there are gender differences in the recruitment and encouragement of candidates to run for office, which is the hypothesis that many of the women I interviewed endorsed. The next barrier is gender gaps in fundraising. So an NPR study in 2018 found that Democratic men raised on average $2.1 million, while Democratic women only raised about $1.5 million. So this gender gap in fundraising is really important because fundraising is used to indicate the seriousness of a candidate. One of the women's political organizations that I studied was actually called Emily's List, and Emily is an acronym that stands for Early Money is Like Yeast, because you're more likely to be successful overall as a candidate if you are able to raise a lot of money quickly in your candidacy. There's another thing that the women I interviewed mentioned, which was really interesting, is that there are just different comfort levels between men and women when it comes to asking for money, and women are less likely to be comfortable asking for strangers for money for their campaigns. There's also racial and economic differences between women themselves. So white women in general are more likely to make more money in society than women of color, due to systemic oppression in the workforce and discrimination in the workforce. So white women are actually more likely to be able to raise money through fundraising than women of color, which is an important distinction to keep in mind. Paku Hang, who is from Vote Run Lead, actually explained the story where this happened. She said, "It was so hard to raise money. People were giving us only $10, $25, where my other white friend, people were giving her $100, $200, $500. It was so clear to me the hurdle women of color have to overcome compared to my white friend." Finally, the last barrier is unpaid labor and caretaking responsibilities. So although in 2019, about 59% of women were in the labor workforce, sociologist Arlie Hochschild discussed this idea of the second shift, which is the concept that women are responsible for the unpaid domestic labor and caretaking responsibilities as opposed to men, despite their involvement in the workforce. And this is important because, as Ms. Hang again describes, our culture and just statistics show that women still do the majority of the housework. They do the majority of the child rearing, plus they're working, they're not staying at home. So there just isn't a lot of time for women to pursue running for public office because running for public office takes a lot of time. So overall, on the left of this table are the general strategies that many of the women's political organizations that I interviewed use. And as you can see, there's a direct correlation between the strategies they use and the barriers that they're trying to overcome. So by providing training to women, they're helping women increase their confidence and eliminate their self-doubt or imposter syndrome. By recruiting women, they're providing extra encouragement for women to run for office and increasing women's political ambition. By helping women fundraise, they're helping women get more comfortable with fundraising and helping a woman show the seriousness of her candidacy. And finally, by providing alumni and support networks, women's political organizations are directly combating the effects of the old boys network. So another one of my research questions was just the ways in which the women's political organizations define success. And while a lot of the answers that they provided match what I predicted, which is the idea of equality amongst women in office, a lot of them also talk about just success being defined as women gaining their voice and confidence, which I think is a really powerful and important metric of success. So to answer the last question, which is why there are so many women's political organizations, Ryan Olson gives a really succinct answer. She says there are 500,000 elected positions throughout this country. There are 500,000 positions that folks could run for. So there's a part that's like, yeah, there are so many women's organizations, but there's so much work to do. There's no part of me that if another women's organization comes onto the scene, I'm like, oh, I'm threatened. But I'm like, great, so I want to help share this load because I know that Emerge cannot alone fill 500,000 seats. So looking ahead, just briefly, some potential research topics that I could pursue based on my research is the long-term impact of COVID-19 on the organizational strategies and programming of women's political organizations, the specific barriers to LGBT women and women of color in political office, and finally, the idea that there is prediction that they're about to become more institutional men's political organizations, which would be really interesting to analyze how their strategies differ from women's political organizations. So just to end this presentation, I want to explain why it's important that women have gender parity in political office. And I think Paku Hang gives a really good reason. She says, women's political leadership allows us to have that diversity of perspective that then makes us an inclusive democracy. And when we are an inclusive democracy, we are a robust democracy. When we're a robust democracy, we're a democracy that is alive, as opposed to a democracy that's dying. So thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions. And here's the QR code for anybody who wanted to scan it who might not have been able to earlier.